Welcome, data enthusiasts. We are Zuma, the recruitment consultancy focused 100% on data professionals in and around the Berlin region. And this is our podcast, Data for Good, connecting you with all things data. And today, my guest is Praveen Kumar. He is team lead of data infrastructure and tracking at Zalando. Hey, Praveen, how's it going today?
Great. What about you?
Good, thank you. Good. And today's topic, Praveen, a topic close to your heart, especially given your job title. We are to talk about on-site customer data collection. And I know we just talked offline about differentiating between website and on-site. So I'd like you to give us an overview of today's topic. Recognizing, of course, Zalando is a high traffic website, so another reason why you'd be an expert on this. And for businesses that we work with around the city of Berlin or wider, and those data teams, whether they're using analytics or Google Analytics or HubSpot or any other tool to collect data, please give us an overview as to today's topic.
All right. So first of all, thanks, Joseph, for having me. It's a privilege to get the opportunity and talk to the wider community. And then, yes, let's just jump into the on-site collection, data collection, also very commonly known in the data industry as the customer tracking. So if I have to, in practice, basically an on-site collection is a practice where businesses and organizations try to understand what their customers are doing on their digital assets. And when I say digital assets, it could be your websites, it could be your apps, or if you have any other touch points, whether you're doing your digital advertisement, your marketing, and all, right. So all these touch points, which are basically giving you an insight into where your customers are coming from, what they actually do when they are in your premises. And when I say premises, in your digital premises, so what kind of activities they are doing. And it can be as granular as like how much time they're spending, what kind of pages they are visiting, or what kind of screens they're going through on the app. Again, right, how's the user flow which is going, right? So because most of the websites or the apps, there is an expected customer journey, and the idea is to understand how the customers are behaving to your offerings, to your products, or whatever your product offerings are. And this data collection basically becomes then the basis for a lot of business steering, decision making, feature iteration. A/B test is very dependent on these kind of tests. On this kind of data set. So in nutshell, if somebody wants to look into how customers are responding to your websites and apps, then the on-site collection becomes the base to it.
Brilliant. And very powerful data indeed. Startups specifically have a very strong focus on customer data from the beginning, right? Because of the powers of return on investment, or the powers or the value that they can gain from all this customer data. Okay. When we look at analytics teams, what does this mean for them, or what are the possibilities for analytics teams when working with on-site customer data?
Yep. I think that's a very good question, and where now the analytics team, it can be a wide array of analytics teams which become the consumer of this data set. And the landscape is changing very quickly, because if you're looking now in 2023, customer journey is becoming more complicated and more multi-touch point, right? So an average user, even when before they come to your website or app, have conscious, somehow they are still aware of you. They have been seeing your ads, so they already are aware of you. And then when they are actually coming to your websites and apps, it gets very difficult to understand, okay, what is bringing them in the first place. So it's quite a complicated multi-touch point environment where the entire online world is. And what it specifically means for analytics teams. And by the way, the data coming from the on-site behavior, it's a huge data set. So all the teams which work with it, I mean, they always have this huge pool of data which gets collected every single day. I mean, you're pretty much tracking every possible thing. Technically, you can do that. You can track every single thing what your user does on your website, and the data size can get huge pretty quickly. And it's also very common that if you don't find your way around how to work with this data, you get drowned very easily. So what does it mean for an analytics team? First of all, I think the very basic here is that when you want to collect some data from the customer, ask yourself or ask, do you really need that data? What's the business problem you can solve with this data? Because with the advancements in the technologies and everything, you can practically track every single thing what a customer does. But do you really need to do that? That's the first thing which you should always ask. Otherwise, I mean, you will end up with so much of data that eventually you'll start getting lost into it. And this
Mm,
also comes to second point, that do you have an alternative for that data which you now want to collect from the onsite? Is there a possibility that data already exists somewhere in the organization? Because for a lot of data teams and orgs, the collection of the data from one side looks like a very straightforward and an easy solution for a lot of things. Okay, if we need this data, we don't have it, why don't we just collect it from the app, from the website, or from our campaigns? So it looks like an easy straight go, but it can very quickly turn into a huge pile of data, which then pretty much gives you nightmares. So that's one thing which is always recommended. Ask yourself twice: do you really need to collect that? And if yes, what is the business impact that data can create?
interesting. So, I mean, my question about the possibilities, we, if you take the situation, we can gather data about customers from a multitude of area these days. It's highly complex how we gather that data. It's not necessarily about the possibilities, but it's the potential burdens of having so much data. And then another topic to be introduced is the data protection laws and the ramifications of these laws with respect to a business collecting all that data. Does your area touch GDPR? Well, I'm
Yeah.
guessing it does, but how does it touch GDPR with, and data privacy generally speaking?
I think anybody who is working with the on-site data collection or the tracking, basically nowadays in 2023, their job is basically revolving around GDPR and the data privacy. So I'll be shocked to see if somebody who's working in the data tracking and is not being involved in the GDPR or the data compliance policies for the company or wherever they are. Uh, it's a fascinating topic because a lot is happening, and a lot has happened in the last few years, and the way the industry is changing. Basically now the industry is driven because of the GDPR and the data privacy laws. uh, and it's not very specific to Europe that we have the GDPR law here. I think it's happening across the globe, that the
Mm,
customers are becoming more and more aware of the data which the companies and the organizations are collecting from them, and the potential of that data. So the customers are becoming very aware of. Second, I think, which, and maybe this is even a more important factor, is that the governments across the world are getting more and more uh, aware and involved into how the organization and businesses are making use of this data. And the third part is basically the customer trust, because eventually for any business, when you are trying to engage a customer, when you're trying to provide them any kind of services, be it an e-commerce, be it a lead generation, you're trying to build a relation with the customer. And when a customer shares their data with you, they are basically trusting you. So it becomes very necessary to ensure that the GDPR laws, and by the way, GDPR laws have so many iterations. Every country within the European Union are making their laws on top of the GDPR. They're evolving very quickly. It's sometimes very difficult to even keep on track of what is changing. Like sometimes there are changes which come in every second month. So, in a nutshell, I think the industry is very driven nowadays with the GDPR. It is changing a lot, and I won't be wrong here to say that down the line in next 2 to 3 years, the way we work with the on-site data collection and the tracking is going to be completely changed. If not completely, I would say at least 80% of the entire landscape is going to change or evolve into more data privacy focused solutions.
Interesting. There's an area that I must remember to go into, and that is the concerns of leadership as well as individual contributors. But you're revealing a bit of a crystal ball there. The next 2 to 3 years, 80% of the landscape in which we work around data privacy is going to change. Give us some insight into this bombshell of yours.
I might have gone a bit overboard by saying 80%, but maybe. And I think if people who are working pretty close with the data sets and the customer data understanding have seen how things have changed very quickly in the last. To start with, I think with iOS 14, the app transparency framework came in, and which pretty much changed the entire way the industry works with Apple and everything. Then a lot of these court rulings which are coming out from especially from the European countries are forcing organizations to think twice. How do they collect the data and how do they store it? Because collecting the data is one part of it, but how actually you are storing the data is also a very important part of it. So these are the things which are obviously giving us a sign. And then if you go into maybe I mean I think it's a public information. Like for example, if you think about Google, they are already planning. In fact, they have started out these plans where they want to get rid of the third-party cookies right by next couple of years. Ideally, they were supposed to do this 2 years back, but obviously due to a lot of these things, it got delayed. So these things are already shaping the way the industry will change, right? I mean, if you go back, not even like if you go back 5 years back, it was very easy. You could just drop in a bunch of cookies, collect data, and then store it forever. Nobody was actually questioning it. But now there are multiple dimensions from where this is changing, and also a lot of big players in the market are evolving. They have a lot of these new, I would say, sandbox environments which are already out in the market, by the way. So if you're interested, or if your job involves working with the customer data, it's highly recommended that go out and work with your partners and see how their new future technologies look like. And yeah, definitely, I'm sure that it's going to change a lot. But one thing would remain still at the base. You would still need to understand your customers, and to do that, you would still need the data. So the necessity
Mm.
and the business requirement of the data is not going to change, but the way you collect that data, the way you store that data, or maybe the way that data is now available to you is going to change. So so the starting requirement is going to be the same. How you use it, what you want to make out of it is more or less going to be the same, but the process in between is going to change a lot.
Very interesting. And I should imagine the process with how customers are able to access and use that data and consent to that data and differentiate between what data points they consent to would also be evolving. Going back to the data community, and if we think about the audience of this podcast being individual contributors and leaders alike, I suspect leaders have to stay close to the standards and practices of data privacy, and particularly in Europe, GDPR laws. How about individual contributors, data analysts, for example, product analysts, marketing analysts? How aware and how cognizant of data privacy do they need to be as a professional? Like, is it going to affect their daily practices? Is it something that they have to think about in additional to their activities?
Yep. Again, a very good point, Joseph. So I think the data privacy, and maybe I'm talking about an ideal setup where everything works in the most compliant way. I think data privacy, first of all, and GDPR should not be just responsibility of a data leader or maybe one team within an organization. Hey, we have a data privacy team, so it's their responsibility. They'll take care of it. We don't need to worry about. I think that's not how you would actually end up having a more compliant and robust setup. I think in 2023, especially when everything is evolving so much, it kind of becomes responsibility of every single individual. And I'll even go extend out of data analysts, so data including data analysts, but every single individual who has access to the customer data and work with that data should have the data privacy and GDPR as a part of their on-job responsibilities. And to start with, it could be as simple as not sharing your customer details over an email to another colleague, or not just
Mm,
dropping everything in a company drive. And it can go up to an extent how your company policies are shaped. Do you have a data retention policy? I mean, just think about it. Do you need to store the data for your customers for next 20 years? Do you really need it? Maybe you need it
mm,
because a lot of businesses really need it. Do you know what kind of granularity do you need to store that data? And it also gets a lot of from multi-direction. It also comes with a lot of cost. Storing data is also a lot of cost which you are incurring, right? So that's the one part. And then I think the other part, again, from your question is how individual contributors. So ideally, every individual should have a very clear understanding of what kind of data they're working with, because even the personal data can have multiple level of sensitivities, right? So they should have a clear understanding of what is the sensitivity of the data they are working with. They should have a clear understanding of who needs to have access to this data. It's not that, okay, you
mm,
have access to data and it's made public now. Every company, every team, and maybe in every individual should have that clear understanding who should have access to the data, who should they be sharing it, and how long should they have access to the data. And I think that's where it becomes a combination of good practices across the organization. I mean, in an ideal way, every organization should have some practice, and I hope they are these practices
mm.
across the companies. They should have a practice like and question every single individual when somebody asks access to the data. They should have a rigorous process. Like, why do you need the data? What is the advantage of you having this data? How would you be using this data? Do you intend to share this data with anybody else? And when these processes are repeated again and again, it kinds of become part of the DNA of any analytical job family, that they have to be very clear about the data privacy and the compliance.
Excellent. With that, would you be able to share any those ideal compliance GDPR compliance situations? Would you have a kind of a rule of thumb, some best practices for businesses when they track analytics?
Mm-hmm.
Are there some best practices that you instill in your team, for example?
Yep, sure. What we can start with, and again, we can go back to the tracking part of it. So technically, you can track anything for a user, right? So let's take a very straightforward example of you have a website, an app, you have an user who comes, and maybe you have an e-commerce website, so you have a customer who comes and shop. Technically, you can have all the information about the user. What is their email ID? What is their phone number? Where they're coming from? How many times they have shopped with you? Now, the question is, do you really need this information? Do you really need the email ID of that customer to be stored? You might need that for transactional use cases where you have to, reach out to them when their orders are shipped. But do you really need their email for analysis? No, I don't think. Do you really need their phone numbers? No. That's just an example, right? So I think as a bottom thumb, and also I think most of the setups, the architecture of these tools, which basically enable the customer analytics from the on-site data, do not even now allow collection of these kind of data.
Mm,
So that's very personal. So there should no PII data collected ever. I think that's a no-no. It's a straightforward red flag that you should never have a PII data collected.
mm.
Second, once that
Anonymized,
yes,
even
that
going as
was I
far
was
as IP
coming to.
addresses. Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
No.
Sorry.
I think
I'm
you
killing your
you
answers here.
yeah. So I think once you have the data, you all the organization should ensure that there has to be a level of anonymization on top of it, right? So when you are storing the data, it should be anonymized. So in a worst case, if somebody gets access to the data who shouldn't have access to, cannot make any business sense out of it. And the third best practice is you should have a data deletion policy. which means, and it
Mm.
has to be a two-way driven business. First of all, your customers should have the ability, or they should have the chance that they can come and request you to delete their data. So you should have a mechanism and process that if somebody requests us to delete their data, we should do it. And this can have then multiple subparts. Maybe if you know that a bunch of your customer, whatever your customer base, X% of them do not engage with you anymore, they are not your customer anymore, then probably it's a best practice to delete their data. Why do you want to
Okay.
keep their data? And again, always have a maybe a yearly, bi-yearly, whatever kind of organization setup you are, review your data deletion policies. Try to keep them up to the date. Uh, Always do these audits, because in the end we are all humans and we work with technologies, and even after following all the best practices, there are some gaps which happen. There might be some data points which are still lying in some data set of your organization which nobody has looked into, but they are in compliant, and that's a big business risk you are talking about. So there should be these policies, again, as a best practice, that audit your data maybe once a year, and question, why do we have this data? Why do we need this? Can we delete it? So that's kind of best practices I would recommend to anyone who's working with the customer data.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that. It's some best practices for Zuma and our reputation, as well as the way we work. I wonder if there's all kinds of ways that businesses like to get around these rules. Making it an opt out rather than a simple click in. I wonder, instead of users having to come in and delete, whether you also give them the option to maybe correct or change the information. It's not a kind of all or nothing, because that,
Mhm.
from a business development perspective, strikes me as a better option, because you're also, by default of them correcting, changing, adding information, you're also giving them the on-off switch, right? So
Mhm.
I guess where I'm going with this is there some kind of tool that allows them to access company systems to edit their data independently?
Okay, let me think about. I think there are again two ways I can think about it. One is, and I think this is again becoming a very common practice, and especially across the Europe, I've seen that the consent data collection. The first time when you ask the users to give their consent is now not anymore just I give you consent or I don't give you consent, right? I think it has evolved a lot, and now if you look to the organizations which really care about their customer relationship, their trust, they're having a more detailed consent information, right, where they give their users an opportunity to go inside their consent systems and pick and choose every single data point which they want to share or not. For example, if you go to an organization in an ideal setup, and they are, let's suppose, you're working with 10 different vendors and they have 13 different tools, then ideally they will let you know, by the way, we work with these 10 different vendors and these
Mm.
13 different tools. Are you comfortable with everyone? And then as a customer, I go in there and say, by the way, out of these 10 vendors the company work with, I am very comfortable with sharing my data with three of them and the rest not. So this is already a practice which is happening, and you can see and go inside. And as a matter of fact, if you go to the consent of Zalando, you would also see that we give this our customers this opportunity to actually pick and choose how we want to collect and for which particular vendors we want to collect and share their data. That's the first part. And again, the second part, once we have the data, do we give the customers an opportunity? I haven't seen an example so far where the customer would get the opportunity to actually change what data we have about them. But I definitely see it's becoming again a common practice that customers can actually request to a company that, hey, by the way, can you tell me what all data you have about me? And then I will make a decision if I want to keep that data with you or I want to delete it. I think that's a common practice. It's very similar to uh, you know, I haven't used Facebook now for ages, but at some point of time, I know Facebook had this feature where you could actually go and check what all data they have about you.
Yeah,
At some
it's
point of time, they were trying to do it.
yeah, it sounds quite manual. I guess it doesn't have to be, does it? They can go and self-service and change it all themselves. Okay. I
That's a
wonder,
good point. I would say that, yeah, I would definitely be interested to see if there are any kind of these options existing in the market
mm,
where a customer can go and actually change the data. I know that they have the option to delete whatever data the companies have, or they can basically ask, okay, by the way, can you tell me what data you have? And then I'll, but oh, interesting point.
mm, mm. Uh, Another area is cybersecurity. I don't recruit across cybersecurity anymore, only data. And we don't usually talk about data security in the roles that we recruit for. Maybe we should some more. I wonder what the interactions are like between um, cybersecurity architects, for example, and data teams internally in large organizations or e-commerce platforms like Zalando. Is there much
Mhm.
interaction there?
Yep. Uh, to start with this one, I would say in especially in large organizations like ours, right, where we have like almost millions of customers coming to our platforms every day, it's quite a complicated system, and it's impossible that just one team can take care of all the privacy, right? So we have, I would say, if I'm just trying to think from the top of my head, we have at least four different teams. That's if not four, maybe five, which can be data privacy, security. We do work very closely with our legal team, at least at Zalando. We ensure that whenever we are working on any data sensitive topic, our legal teams are involved, and we always, I think that's the first point nowadays. That's the first step for us to work with any of the new data projects, that we always go and ask our legal team, hey, by the way, this is our plan. This is what we intend to do. Do you see any issues with them? And if they see an issue, then we are, a lot of times we are just asked to drop the plan because it's not legally compliant. And once we get approvals from legal, then we talk to our privacy teams, where they come and check our infrastructure, what kind of technologies we are trying to work with. So it's a legal, data privacy, and then some cybersecurity teams. We also have our cloud experts who give us the best, you know, um, the best ways to work with the cloud technologies and to ensure that everything is compliant. And then comes on top of it all the data owners and the data storage principles we have in the organization. So it's a combination of multiple layers of compliance and security checks.
Interesting. And interesting stakeholder interactions there across different disciplines, legal and cybersecurity, that is. You've related to Zalando. One, or at least myself, I constantly come back to, or I'm inclined to come back to Meta and Facebook, and because they're constantly under scrutiny with their data policies and how customer data is used. Are there any other businesses that you could kind of signpost in terms of big case examples of tracking and data privacy?
Mhm. Uh, I think it's again a news in the public, but lately there have been a lot of rulings across Sweden, and I think there were a couple of cases earlier in France where there were issues. A lot of companies were basically challenged on their data collection. They were basically asked to stop it. And the problem was that it was a big fuss in the industry, right? Okay, by the way, now these countries are preventing the collection of the user data, and we might have to find another way around it. But the bottom of that was that the problem was not with the collection of the user data. The problem was how you were collecting it and how you were storing it. And I think a lot of times when, especially in the data collection and the tracking domains, when we hear these kind of news, we always miss the nuances out of these rulings, right? And sometimes I would recommend, when you are hearing some kind of new update, and it's very common nowadays, right? Every second and third month, you will hear some other country would come out with a standard ruling, and they would find a bunch of companies. By the way, your data collection is wrong. And then when you start reading into the details of those rulings, you find out that most of those companies are getting fined or getting called out legally is not because they're collecting the data, it's because they are collecting it in a not compliant manner. Another thing, though this is something which I would like to remember from the recent happenings.
Interesting. Right on time for my kind of final advice question. I think it's been great the way you've gone through the considerations, best practices, or simply even the questions that teams need to ask themselves. I wonder, finally, if there's any more advice you'd give for data analytics teams or team leaders or even individual contributors about how to approach data collection from now on, especially with your crystal ball about the next 2 to 3 years. How can those stakeholders approach data collection?
I think based on my experience and also talking to a lot of my friends who are in the pretty much in the same domain, what organizations are actually a lot of organizations have actually started doing it. They've started identifying the first party data options, right? Like, do you really need to work very heavily with the data collection happening from the customer website, or apps, or can you build these data systems which are completely the first party data based? And when I say first party data, basically uh, trying to build your own data products where the data never leave your own premises. I think that's one advice I can give. That I mean, we are also trying to do a lot of these new things, trying to understand how we can build these own self-reliant systems. That's one thing. Second, yes, working with the tracking technologies is exciting, very fascinating, and also you can impact a lot of your business decisions. But the way the GDPR and the data privacy scenario is evolving, you'll have to be on top of the changes happening in the industry. You definitely need to dedicate a lot of time in exploring what is happening, test and try it out, bring in your ideas how you can combine the best of both the world, right? So maybe you can work with a bit of vendors, bit of create your own data products, and then blend your data to make the most out of it. That would be my one advice, especially for the data leaders who would continue to work with the on-site data in the future.
Super, thank you. First party data collection, do you really need it? Another good question to ask. Secondly, tracking technologies, staying on top of the frequently and ongoing evolutions to data protection laws. Great, that's super. You've shined a light on this for me as a business leader. It's something that I and we need to stay way more close to, and we're not even the data technical experts, so it's clearly a topic that affects everybody. Yeah, and many of us don't know as much as we should, perhaps. Praveen, thanks very much for today. I really appreciate your time, your energy, and putting thought into this conversation as well. It's been a great insight for me.
Thanks for having me, Joseph. Likewise, it was really nice to talk to you, and I hope that I am able to share out some of my experiences, and the community can have some benefits out of it.
Brilliant. You know something? If not too many, if I do get some questions about this podcast, I will link you in to the LinkedIn comments as well. So hopefully people can fire the questions at you, and yeah, we can take the conversation further.
Yep, sounds like a plan.
Super. Thanks, Praveen.